My name is Haley, and I'm here to help you get the most out of your OEFFA conference experience. Thank you so much for being here with us in person, and thank you for wearing your mask so that we can gather in the safest manner possible for all members of the OEFFA community. Please make sure that your mask is fully covering your mouth and nose, and refrain from eating for the duration of this workshop. Before we begin, we'd like to remind you to wear your name badge in a visible location on your person and not on the bag. To make the most of this session, we ask that everyone ask questions at the appropriate point. When would you like them to ask questions? At the end? Okay, at the end. Keep on topic and allow the conversation to move forward so everyone has a chance to participate. Please remember that this workshop is being recorded. All workshop recordings will be available to all registered attendees via the conference app until March 31st. After I turn things over to the speaker, I will pass evaluations to the front row on each side of the room. Please take one and pass it along. It's short and should only take a minute or two of your time. Please fill it out and return the form to me at the door before moving on to the next activity. The event organizers thank you for taking the time to do this. It's helpful for recording and to improve the quality of our conference. And now, please welcome Jim Embry.
Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell Pharaoh to let my people go. Let my people go. This African American spiritual embodies my presentation this morning. I think it also embodies this conference, its mission and purpose. And here are a few reasons why. This spiritual embodies the life of George Washington Carver, as he sought throughout his life to free himself and his people from the Pharaoh of racial oppression and violence, from lack of education, from hatred of any sort, and freedom from poverty and health disparities. Carver was continually transforming himself and those around him. Now, some of us consider Harriet Tubman as the Moses of our people. Some of us also say we regard George Washington Carver also as the Moses of our people, who was called to serve in Egypt. We call it the South. But he also served the entire nation and the world. This song is also relevant to the conference because each of us should be able to identify the pharaohs in our work. Maybe the pharaoh is this huge global footprint of monopoly agribusinesses that seek even greater control over our agricultural systems and food supply. Or maybe the Pharaoh is this mechanical worldview, this Newtonian Cartesian view of the world that sees the earth as an inanimate object to be mined and devastated. See her as a resource for predatory behavior rather than the earth as the source of life. Or maybe the Pharaoh is this systemic racism that impacts people of color. Then again, maybe the Pharaoh is our society is this continual violence and oppression of women that is most acute in the food and agricultural sector. Many of us can remember our beloved Wangari Maathai, who led the Greenbelt movement in Kenya, where she connected the oppression of women with deforestation. We recognize that the oppression of women, mothers, who we all come through, is connected to the devastation of our Mother Earth. So over this weekend, and in our continuing work, we will collectively better understand how our work is to let my people go. But this work must include not just human people. It must also include freeing the animal people, the plant people, the air people, the water people, and the rock people. Now, if you remind me during the Q&A part of the session, remind me to tell you the story about rock people from an indigenous standpoint. Now, since February is Black History Month, let's begin with something African. Sankofa is an African word from the Akan people in Ghana. This Sankofa bird, in my view, represents the essence of my presentation today. This idea of it's okay to reach back and grab some history, tradition, wisdom, and bring it forward as a way of providing light for the pathway ahead. This Sankofa bird symbolizes this taking the best of this ancient knowledge and wisdom and carrying it forward as seeds. So my presentation today will be this back and forth of going back and grabbing some history to help us move forward. Now, in looking back, so I live in Madison County, Kentucky, on a 30-acre family farm, which sits at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, some of the oldest in the world. Our farm is also fed by the Kentucky River watershed, and it's nourished by the soil heavily mineralized with limestone rock. This is land that was inhabited for some 20, 30,000 years by the Shawnee, Cherokee, and other indigenous peoples. Our family have been land stewards of this area since the early 1800s, when we were brought to Kentucky from Virginia in an enslaved condition. In this condition of enslavement, we worked this land. We cared for this land. Our grandmothers had babies in the fields in this land. And we learned to love the land. Now, my great-great-grandparents, who were formerly enslaved, 25 years after the Civil War ended, purchased this land from the Europeans who stole the land. So I come from 5 generations of what I call agrarian intellectual activists. And I will share more about this later in my talk. Now, this idea, this theme of rooted and rising. Again, I am blessed and honored to be here today to take part in this 43rd annual OEFFA conference. This is my very first conference, and I hope to participate in years to come. Now, let me just share a few of my reflections on this theme of rooted and rising. The word rooted reminds me of our deep need to be rooted in our community. Much like George Washington Carver was for 47 years at Tuskegee. This idea of rootedness reminds me of humans who've been around the earth for about 2 million years. And the rootedness of plants with seeds, flowers, and fruit that have been around for 200 million years. I think about the rootedness of 500 plus indigenous nations that live in North America, oftentimes called Turtle Island, for the last 20 to 30,000 years. And I think about us, who've been here the last 500 years, however we came here. And we're still trying to figure out what it means to be rooted in this land. The word rooted also reminds me that we as humans, unlike trees, don't have our feet anchored in the soil, in the land. But our challenge in this conference ought to have as part of its purpose to help us reclaim this sacred rootedness, this sacred relationship with the land from which we're all made. Now again, George Washington Carver provides a model of how to be rooted. Each morning at Tuskegee, he would get up hour before sunrise, go into his garden, go into the forest, communicate with the plants, the trees, the stars, and would ask them to communicate with him. And they did. So, we're all sensitive to this idea of indigenous people here in North America. Part of our responsibility is to honor those cultures of people, but also we each need to go back and understand our cultural lineage of indigenous peoples around the world and learn from our own cultural rootedness. And I maintain that we also ought to proclaim, shout out, say hallelujah, that we are all indigenous to the earth. Now, we also need to be rooted in our nation's founding. This image says, America is stolen land, built by people who were stolen from their land to do agriculture. So this nexus of land and labor for food and agriculture production is the foundation of injustice in our country that has permeated all other institutions. But here's the good news. Here at this juncture of food and agriculture, this juncture of dispossession and displacement, at this juncture, there is the possibility, the potentiality of transforming our food and agricultural systems, and by doing so, then transform all other institutions. And Carver understood this very well. Carver said, an injustice to the soil is an injustice to the farmer. Now he meant specifically black farmers, black sharecroppers. And then in return, an injustice to the farmer is an injustice to the soil. Now, isn't that the essence of quantum science? That we're all interconnected. We're all from the same source. Now, since we're here in Dayton, being rooted ought to mean lifting up the legacy of the great American poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, who was born here in Dayton and whose mother and father were enslaved in Kentucky. Now, Paul was friends with the Wright brothers, and they did, as you know, their own way of rising. But Paul was also friends with the likes of Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, and George Washington Carver, to name a few. Booker T. Washington asked Paul Laurence Dunbar to write the song for Tuskegee Institute, which he did. And George Washington Carver visited Paul Laurence Dunbar and his mother several times in their home. Now, while you're in Dayton, if time allows, I encourage you to visit the Paul Laurence Dunbar house, or do a drive-by. Take a picture, take a selfie. Because we talk about being rooted. Now, allow me just to read a short verse from one of Dunbar's poems called Sympathy. I know why the cage bird sings. Amen. It is not a carol of joy or glee, but a prayer that he sends from his heart's deep core, but a plea that upward to heaven he flings. I know why the cage bird sings. Now, this is a photo of Paul and his mother, Matilda. Again, Matilda was inside Kentucky, in Shelbyville, before migrating north after the Civil War. Matilda grew up hearing poetry and yearning to write poetry. She taught her son Paul how to read and write, and also taught him how to write and love poetry. So Paul was rooted in his mother, as we all are. Now, this slide here I did just this morning. The idea of being rooted in Dayton. This here is an image of my dear friend Bing Davis. He's an incredible artist. He's a shop over on 3rd Street. And we hung out yesterday for quite a while. And I thought, well, no better person to share with you all about being rooted in Dayton, but also rooted in poetry and art. This movement of regenerative, organic, permaculture, biodynamic, agricultural movement needs to be essentially grounded in art. Now, Bing and I were talking yesterday and we were reminding ourselves of one of our other favorite poets. Her name is Toni Cade Bambara. And she has a quote that I oftentimes mention when I'm talking. And what Toni says is that the role of an artist is to make revolution irresistible. I'll say it again. The role of an artist, and it could be all of our roles, whatever we do in this work. The role of an artist is to make revolution, change, transformation, regeneration irresistible. And that was the essence of the life of George Washington Carver. Every day, he brought light in and sent light out to make change irresistible. Now, the reason why I read that poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar was because it inspired Maya Angelou to embrace it as the title of her book, I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. Where she described how we can overcome, we can rise up. That's the self-esteem. We can rise up out of our individual and collective trauma and then manifest our divine light, our divine purpose, our divine work. So let's read this short verse from Maya. Read it together, like we're in church. Just like moons, don't hear y'all out there, and like suns, with the certainty of tides, just like hopes springing high, still I'll rise. Now, and if I could get someone on the team facilitation, got about an hour and a half, about maybe about an hour in, just raise your hand, shout me down, whatever.
I'm raising my hand.
Okay, thank you, very good. I've got a bunch of slides here and stories to tell, and but we'll have to have some time for just some conversation as well. Now, what I want to do is just take some time to describe how I got here today. About 2 years ago, I was the co-chair of the local planning committee for this conference, the North American Association for Environmental Education. And part of my interaction with this organization, as with Sierra Club and many other environmental groups, is to get them to understand that agriculture is part of the environmental movement. Agriculture has, per sector, probably the largest footprint on the environment. But because we're all impacted by this Newtonian Cartesian view of the world, we view things in separations, in silos. But anyway, at that conference, Eric Pulaski, who is the Sustainable agriculture educator, I believe, for OEFFA, approached me and asked me if I could come up to Ohio to be a part of this conference. I said, yeah, they do allow Kentuckians to cross the Ohio River. I would be honored. That's the short of how I got here. Now, but my connection with Eric goes back even further. July 2019, we were both in Denver for the Slow Food Nations gathering. And I have my Slow Food Nations cup here. And then in 2018, Eric and I found ourselves again in Portland. At this association conference, Balance Conference in Portland. Because, you know, Eric and I go to all the hip conferences, okay? I don't know about the OEFFA staff, don't travel like Eric does, okay? But I just fall behind him. Now, as the screen shows, at this conference, I was invited to write a blog preceding the conference. And I chose this article that was kind of comparing and contrasting the life of George Washington Carver and Rudolph Steiner. It's called The Cup of Carver. There's the link. I have in my bag a few copies if you would like one. Now, when you go to the OEFFA website and you go to the website of other organic farming organizations, and we can look at who the pioneers were, oftentimes you see Steiner's name there, Robert Rodell, Eve Balfour, Howard, who found his theories out of the indigenous people in India. They're listed. Not Carver, hardly at all. Now, you can read the articles and talk about, well, Steiner in 1923 wrote his agricultural course. 1923. But I pointed out in this article that Carver had already published 25 bulletins about what we now call organic agriculture by 1923. And I use on my farm various kinds of principles, including those that are biodynamic. I ain't hating on Steiner. I'm just trying to understand how folks can ignore the work of Carver that was so essential. Now, many of you all know that Steiner is also regarded as the founder of the Waldorf schools, which part of its approach is to have kids outside a lot in nature. And he founded the schools in 1919. I've been to a bunch of them. But in the article, I pointed out that Carver was a leader in the nature study movement from the 1890s. And one of his very first bulletins at Tuskegee in 1898 was about nature study and schools. Carver understood that to transform agricultural system, we had to make sure that our children were rooted at an early age, rooted in land-based education. Carver understood that our children needed not this homocentric view of the world, but a more earth-centric view of the world. Now that year, they had me on double duty. I wrote a blog. I was also asked to write a lead article for their journal entitled Transforming the Heart of Agriculture. Now, I share these articles because they go into greater depth, provide all kinds of links, of course, and you can get these, again, online on my website. I have a few of them here as well. So I encourage you to take time to look at these articles that share more of these thoughts about how we transform agriculture. Now, I mentioned that, and y'all can do it now while you're sitting there on your phones. Put a link in, put a Google search. Organic agriculture, who are the pioneers? I bet you won't find Carver's name. So this situation reminds me of the book by Ralph Ellison called Invisible Man, where Carver is relegated within some sectors of this invisibility. So part of the role of OEFFA, Rooted and Rising, and all of our other kindred spirits ought to be to make Carver visible. Now, a few of my other involvements. This past April 2021, this book, We Are Each Other's Harvest, was published by Natalie Bazille, who is also the author of a book called Queen Sugar. It's her first novel that Oprah Winfrey and Ava DuVernay bought the rights to it and made it into this TV series. It all came from this book, Queen Sugar. Her first book, because of Oprah's help, went platinum. So HarperCollins gave her another contract to write a book about Southern black farmers. But it got expanded into the experiences across the country of black and brown farmers. It's a beautiful book. Standing on my little altar. When I speak,
you got about 15 minutes, Jim.
Thank you. I always try to bring these elements of the natural world that we talk about. But we don't think they ought to be present. So I bring those vibrations of Carver's peanuts and wood and feathers and rocks and things like that. Back to the book. Now, isn't this front cover image a beautiful image? Maybe you don't know, these are sisters Leah and Naima Penniman of Soul Flower Farm and the book Farming While Black. Now, a few of you all might remember during World War II. Remember the image of Rosie the Riveter with her biceps looking like Michelle Obama's biceps? You know, an icon of women being called into the workforce in the industrial plants, the shipyards, while the men were fighting in Europe.
I gave you a long time. You got 45 minutes.
Thank you.
That'll make him
I said,
happy.
well, I know I talk fast. I have speeded the earth up, turning. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. Now, this is a beautiful book, folks. Beautiful photography. It's got poetry, first-hand articles, interviews, wonderful resources. But now, I maintain that this image of Leah and Naima ought to be our cultural icon. Of this century. Representing this return to the land by women and men. And we can do that in a variety of ways. Now, these sisters and I share a very deep, abiding love for George Washington Carver. Now, here's an added reason to buy the book and add it to your home library. Three years ago, 2019, I was invited by Natalie to contribute an article to this book because she'd heard me back again. She heard about me giving a talk in Portland about Carver and Steiner. And one of her friends, Melanie Edwards, who's up in Seattle, had heard me speak and went and blabbed on me, told on me. There's a crazy-ass guy in Kentucky that his folk had connections with Carver back on their farm. So, this essay is entitled, if you can read, Ancestral Vibrations Guide Our Connections to the Land. And what I do now, and I wear a variety of hats, I do a bunch of stuff. But I always try to lift up these connections, these ancestral connections that guide me every day. Now, this essay specifically allowed me to tell the story of our family in Madison County. Lift up my great-great-grandparents. We had 3 great-granddads that fought in the Civil War. One died in the Civil War. Now, if you look at the muster rolls of those men and women, again, some 200,000 black men and women fought in what's called the U.S. colored troops. And if you read their muster papers and their occupation, they were listed as farmers. So I regard this inclusion by Lincoln as the encouragement of Frederick Douglass, this inclusion was called the U.S. colored troops as the legalized armed rebellion of black farmers. And these soldiers, some of them carried swords and guns and whatever. When they came back home, they turned those swords into plowshares. This is a picture of my great-grandparents who were children when the Civil War ended. And they're all pretty much located around where they'd been enslaved for all kinds of reasons. Harriet Ballou became the area midwife and the herbal healer, herbal doctor, this area of Madison County. These are all brothers and sisters. Nanny was a seamstress, well known for her embroidery work, making all kinds of beautiful, fantastic clothing. And their brother, who is my direct line great-grandfather, Don Carlos, was a blacksmith, school teacher, but they were all small farmers as well. They were all able, again, as I mentioned earlier, they were able, 20-some years post the Civil War, to buy small parcels of land all near each other. Now, I'm going to do another family commercial break, talking about family parcels. Over here on my left, raise your hand, Brian, is my cousin Brian Martin, lives here in Dayton. He's the executive director, I believe, for all the development that goes on in this county. My cousin Brian Martin, see him afterwards. He'll help you get through all the development channels. But his family owns in western Kentucky 900 acres that were all members of the family assembling parcels of land together post the Civil War. On their property was a Rosenwald school. That's another whole presentation. The Rosenwald schools, funded by Julius Rosenwald at the request of Booker T. Washington. George Washington Carver drew some of the sketches for the schools and also provided the landscape design for these schools. Across from my farm in Richmond, Kentucky, was one of these Rosenwald schools where my great-grandfather Don Carlos taught at. All of these great-grandparents, again, were small farmers, and they were part of what's called the Black Farmer Cooperative in Kentucky. It was also throughout the South. George Washington Carver, part of his work, and Du Bois, was to encourage these farm cooperatives. We realize now, if we're talking about transforming agriculture, cooperatives are a key, essential part of that transformation process. It has been historically, and it remains that way. My great-grandfather was also a school teacher, and he was part of the Black School Teacher Association. So this collaboration between black farmers and black school teachers had them organize every year what was called back then this colored Chautauqua experience in Kentucky. And I've been still researching this phenomenal experience. The local newspapers talk about how in 1919, at this colored Chautauqua, 1,500 black folk came to Richmond. Why? Because the speakers were the likes of Du Bois, Carver, Mary Church Terrell, and so forth. Folks came from Lexington, Cincinnati, probably even Dayton. Because again, remember, Carver was connected to Dayton through Paul and Dunbar and the black community here. Folk came probably from Louisville, maybe Detroit, because they came to hear these great speakers. Now, the reason why I mention this particular Chautauqua in 1919, because we're talking about this work of transformation. And I'm saying that Carver ought to be a student that we look at. We should be studying him to understand today, how do we transform our relationships with each other, organizations, individuals, elected officials? How do we do that? Carver provides light down the road. Now, many of you all probably don't know another connection from 1919. But can you imagine in the small town of Richmond, Kentucky, 1,500 black folk assembling to learn about agriculture, cooperatives, working together, benevolent societies. And they had a reading list before they came. It's all in the newspaper. They were encouraged to read the works of Paul Laurence Dunbar, Langston Hughes, Phyllis Wheatley, books by Ida B. Wells, Du Bois, Booker T. Washington. They had a reading list. Now, I came to this conference. I go to many conferences, but there usually ain't no reading list to prepare us for our conversations, prepare us for some type of common ground. Why look back? St. Bird says. Now here's the importance of 1919. 1919, so named by Langston Hughes, James Gordon Johnson, Red Summer. That was the summer when almost 40 cities around the country, white supremacists were on the attack, burning down communities, shooting people, killing, hanging people, black folk. Matter of fact, in Elaine, Arkansas, it says that some 200 black people and 5 white people were killed. It was called the Elaine Massacre. This is the book that kind of lays out in more detail Red Summer. Here's how it looks on a map. But I mentioned earlier, the same year of Red Summer, Carver, Du Bois, my beloved great-grandparents, and those who were assembled were able to carry out this weekend experience without violence. Now, they were helped, of course, by about 20 local white citizens who probably served as a buffer, as a protection, telling the other folks, and look here, my county in Richmond, on a presentation about that, was back in the Civil War, still is. I call it Confederate stronghold. But the point is that Carver, as I mentioned, his whole life is about transforming what was around him. So in our work, when there is antagonism, maybe there's violence, maybe there's upheavals, how can we learn from Carver how to transform that antagonistic, potentially violent situation? Now, I'm going to run through kind of quickly a few of the slides, describe some of my work. A couple of weeks ago, I gave a similar kind of a keynote to the Organic Seed Growth Conference. It was virtual. I'm also a member in Kentucky of our Organic Association as well. Gave a talk to that conference back in January. Now, the Organic Seed Growth Conference, that conference had about 1,200 people from 30 different countries. As we know, this is a global movement. This was about seeds. In my talk, I pointed out in my talk that Carver was all about seeds. Organic seeds, heirloom seeds. And the Jesuit wagon that he and Booker T. Washington fashioned and got monies for, he always carried a variety of seeds to give the farmers, along with the bulletins, potential tools, plans, know-how. So I was advising them, as you are working on this sense of organic seeds, let's don't forget what's coming before us. We can't just write up a manifesto about racial justice, equity. Got to be more intentional. Now again, in my family, we have a long history of working in cooperatives in a variety of ways. I heard these stories growing up from my mother, my aunts and uncles. So in 1972, back when I was a bit younger, my wife, kids, and I were founders of what's called Good Foods Market and Cafe. This is inside the store. It's a natural foods cooperative. About 10,000 owner members. Do about $15 million a year in business. We were founded upon three principles: local food, organic food, and healthy food. They aren't always the same. The image here, the big brother, big black guy there, it's a good friend of mine named Rob. He's the current general manager. Because we had to internally have some come to Jesus moments about what it means to be for diversity, equity, racial justice. It ought to mean seeing faces in the store and in certain positions. It was 50 years ago. This year we're celebrating our 50-year anniversary. Last year I was part of this effort to organize the Ujama Seed Cooperative. And we have a particular interest in what we call culturally meaningful seeds, especially those of the African diaspora. This is some of the board members here. If you all don't know the wonderful Ira Wallace of the Southern Exposure Seed Exchange, that's her holding the frame with the glasses on next to me, Ira Wallace. Also, like in 2008, became a member of Slow Food USA and Slow Food International, and we do a whole host of things. Various kind of programs, the Ark of Taste, which is a cataloging of seeds and other kinds of foodstuffs, like the churro sheep that the Dene people of Navajo had been shepherding for some 500 years, preserving those kinds of cultural foodways. As a part of this transformation, this reaching back, make sure that we're preserving these traditional varieties, because there's an onslaught, as we know, we all know that, there's an onslaught to reduce the diversity of what we eat, what we grow. So our work in transforming ought to be to this work on at local, regional, national, international levels of diversifying and reaching back and reclaiming these varieties. Terra Madre is one of our events held every 2 years. The last one in person was 2018. I invite you all to come to Torino, Italy in September. The 2022 in-person Terra Madre meeting Mother Earth. Kind of a title borrowed from the Pachamama Alliance. We have as well an indigenous Terra Madre network. We have a Turtle Island delegation of indigenous folks from North America who come under their own banner of Turtle Island. This idea of transformation, food sovereignty. Speaking of that, part of our work needs to be to reach back and understand who are the people that live here in the Ohio region, or wherever you live. How do we understand their culture? How do we lift it up? What were those traditional agricultural foodways? It's another whole presentation. Now, I'm reaching a point of Q&A, but I want to mention, in 2018, I was in Toronto representing Slow Food USA at this Parliament of World Religions. It included 10,000 people at the Toronto Convention Center, like we have here, from about 200 countries. And every faith on the planet was there. Now here's why I mention it. You see the water here. The conference began with First Nations women going to the river to do a water ceremony. Then they did that ritual and brought the water back up outside the convention center, where the men were about to start the sacred fire. The sacred fire burned 24/7 for a whole week. It was a place for spiritual rejuvenation, drumming, singing, dancing. When I was working with Will Allen of Growing Power in the Growing Food Injustice gatherings, we also scheduled our gathering based upon the full moon weekend. You say, well, Jim, like, Man, we heard you was crazy, now you showing you're crazy. Why would you schedule a conference around a full moon? And why would you have women out getting wet and folk around the fire? We're talking about transformation. On the full moon, the women go out on their own and do a grandmother moon ceremony. Because we understand how the moon impacts women's menstrual cycle. Not just the ocean tides. So I'm encouraging OEFFA, as I've done other conferences, to kind of rethink how we present our conferences. At this conference as well, they had one of the convention rooms was like fabricated with willow branches to create a longhouse. This circular experience where the First Nations people had programming there from about 7 a.m., began with morning prayers and dancing until the evening. They had cedar, they had willow. I said, wow, they did the fire and this lodge and the convention center? Yes, they did. Now, I mention that to say that next year, in 2023, the pub will be in Chicago. Now, in 2018, I was on a panel with a variety of people talking about food justice, economic issues. I did a workshop on food sovereignty through the lens of George Washington Carver and indigenous people. At the conference, I had the blessing to meet a guy named Arun Gandhi, who was a grandson of Mahatma Gandhi. And I talked about the connection between Gandhi and Carver. Now, what I'm going to do, take time, I want to allow room for some. Have you ever wondered how Dr. King adopted his nonviolent philosophy from Gandhi? Talk about being rooted. Well, it actually goes back to Carver. And we're talking about this idea of transformation through the lens of Carver. Back in the 20s, Gandhi, as you know, had left South Africa, had moved back home to India, and was trying to lead this movement, this revolution, this transformation of Indian hierarchy controlled by the British government, of Indian peasants. And he was fasting. And Gandhi had heard about this black guy in the United States who was also working with peasant sharecroppers. He was also working to create all these products out of peanuts. 300 some odd products. working with cowpeas, sweet potatoes, soybeans. And Gandhi wanted to better understand part of his coming off of a fast and utilizing various kinds of like peanut milks and soy milks and things of that nature. Of course, as we realize, going to the stores now, with all these non-dairy products, Carver wrote bulletins on those for years. When you go into that section and get that non-dairy, whatever it might be, think about, wow. That's what Carver was talking about way back in the 1900s. But, so Gandhi sent an emissary to the United States to talk to Carver specifically about his work, his products, his philosophy, because again, Carver was already living this nonviolent philosophy. So in the 1930s, there was a guy named Howard Thurman, his wife, who were doing a tour of Asia, who was friends with Carver. And Carver said, well, hey, Howard, can you and your wife go over? You ought to stop by India and say hi to my friend Gandhi. And they did. Thurman came back. He was good friends with a guy named Benjamin Mays, who also went to India at the request of Gandhi. Carver, look here. Here's a letter from my dear friend Gandhi to Benjamin Mays. Now, Benjamin Mays and Howard Thurman were also good friends with Dr. King's father. And advised his father, and advised King, they knew King as well, Dr. King. The King, man, we've been to India, we've met with Gandhi, he's the real deal. I'm just saying that Carver's life every day was about transforming himself and transforming those around him, and also embracing being transformed by environments around him. How's my time?
10 minutes left.
Okay. So, thank you all for listening. Feel free to contact me by email, by phone. Come to the farm. See me the rest of the weekend. So again, I encourage us all, if we're talking about transforming agriculture, and Carver did this in the South. He was about enhancing black soil that was impoverished, and also enhancing the livelihood of black souls in the South. His work, his life, and legacy, in my view, are essential to whatever we're doing in our local communities, in our organizations, in our faith institutions. His work, in my view, is essential. But of course, not only his, of course not. So, thank you. I'm open now for questions, thoughts, reflections. reflections. Yes.
You said to remind me to mention the rock people.
Oh yeah. You know, I was in on a retreat out in Seattle, sponsored by the folks at Yes Magazine. Everybody here know Yes Magazine? Okay. If you don't know Yes Magazine, subscribe to it, get it online, okay? They're the real deal. They're dear friends of mine. Began years ago by my dear friends Fran and David Corton. And David and I were on the panel in Toronto at the Parliament. So we were in this retreat out in Seattle that was sponsored by what's called the Fetzer Institute. They're in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and they fund what's called spiritually based activism. If you haven't been there, go check them out. Need some money for programming. They also give money for programs as well. So for 5 years, retreats that include the likes of Danny Glover, my dear friend and mentor, Grace Boggs, Joanna Macy, Vincent Rosemarie Harding, all kinds of people, very mixed in terms of age and whatever else. So we were in this, there's also a book on the Yes Magazine website called, my mind's going brain dead, something about transformation. But anyway, see me and I'll give you the link. But anyway, so we're in this retreat. I was giving a morning ritual honoring the 4 directions and all the people. Human people, plant people, air, water, whatever. And my last mention was rock people, which I just kind of like, just pushed quickly aside. And one of the, I think they're called the Northwest people, the Squamish people, there's a brother who was there who was crying. When I got finished, I said, wow, must have been a powerful ritual, you know? His name was Tim with a long name, I forget. He says, I said, well, hey, why are you crying? He said, well, here's why I'm crying. Because you gave a lot of honor to, human people, animal people, plant people, water people, and you barely mentioned rock people. I said, well, yeah. He said, well, here's why I was crying. He said, in my people's cosmology, it was the rock people in human evolution that told the Creator, like, okay, you're going to bring what on the earth? Human beings? Well, they're going to be like, out there unprotected. They're going to be, hard to survive. Like, they're going to be a weak species. Like, yeah, we know. Well, so rock people said, well, come into me and gouge out my insides, grind up my rock to create earth, land, soil, to grow plants, fruit, berries, fruit. Well, they have food to eat. They can't make their own food. So, that's what rock people did. They gouged their insides out to create land, soil, dirt. They said also, until they began to discover fire and tools and weapons and whatever to create housing, they'll all die. So here again, rock folks said, well, Creator, gouge me out deeper. Gouge me out deeper to create caves. So this weak species, this youngest species, can survive. Now, Carver was 12 years old. He was trying to get more education. At 12 years old, he left home from Diamond, Missouri, and walked 8 or 10 miles to the one-room black schoolhouse. And he carried with him in his bundle a few elements of clothing, some favorite roots, and his favorite rocks. Now, real quickly, Carver's specialty was fungi. He had 4 named after him. He said, quit naming them things after me. I don't want no more. He sent about 800 or 900 up to the fungi, warehouse, vault. Anyway, so that's the story of rock people. So I always carry with me various rocks. And I ask people all the time, who feels close to rocks? Very few hands go up. Okay, I ask that question, and I'm talking, and I say, well, look here, what makes blood red? They say, oh, oxygen. I said, no, blood carries oxygen. Why is it red? Because of iron in the carbon-hydrogen chain. That's why it's red. Why are our bones so hard? He said, well, calcium. I said, yeah, and 23 what? 23 other trace minerals. We're like walking rocks. But see, we don't think we're connected to rocks. As part of that Newtonian Cartesian view of the world is these inanimate things. Anyway, other questions? Sorry.
What else do you have up there on that?
Oh, I've got, up there I have, again, one of those retreats. And again, those retreats, art was infused throughout. We always made things, again, with Growing Power conferences, we always made things with our hands. It's important because humans evolved through the opposing thumb and 5 fingers, and the idea of transforming nature helped make us human. We see around us a lot of incivility. I think it's important to get young people being creative, using our hands, and turning on that human civility gene. But anyway, up there is a talking stick that we made at one of the retreats. We brought wood in, did some carving, did some beadwork. Then at the close of the conference, retreat, then we bestowed on another a talking stick. Up there are shells, various kinds of shells, various kinds of rocks, cedar and lavender and Tibetan singing bowl. I usually begin sessions with the idea of the healing power of sound. A kente cloth. I got up there as well some peanut seeds, some cowpea seeds, things like that nature. It's like an altar, if you want to call it that. It's again the idea of bringing those elements. I go to a lot of conferences on a lot of topics, but we don't think. I try to wear things as well that carry those energies. Again, quantum science says the smallest fractal of life is a string vibration. Everything's vibrating. Everything is vibrating. And part of our work in life is to be in resonance with these earth-centric vibrations. Earth's been around, we say, about 4.5 billion years. And wow, what magic. I can't even sometimes fathom all that she has been doing her whole existence. She just might know something. But see, we get taught in all of our schools, K through 12, college, no one tells you, well, hey, when you come into college, you're going to be an expert in this Newtonian Cartesian view of the world. The earth is a mechanical clock. She's inanimate. You don't know nothing. We're superior. We know it all. That's what we're taught. That's how we act. Do we have to unlearn some things? Yes, Ryan.
We talk, cousin Jim. If Carver had your charisma, do you think he would be better known in history?
I love Mr. Quiet. I love Mr. Quiet. Now.
Love it.
Thank you. Great work. Let me say this right here. I mentioned that Carver knew Dunbar. He was friends with Henry Ford. They had a whole green vision. It's a book called The Green Vision of Carver and Ford. You ought to buy it, check into it. They wanted to make the entire automobile off of products grown by American farmers. The entire automobile. Even the body made from soybeans. But anyway, Carver knew Einstein, knew Edison. And they all said, Edison, Einstein, Ford said, Carver was the greatest scientist of his time. That's what they said about him. But he was charismatic. When he spoke to people, it was like poetry. It was like a prayer. We're taught to say a blessing when we eat, or say a prayer in the morning or in the evening. He spoke that way all the time. All the time. One quick example. In 1920, at the request of the U.S. Peanut Company, he was asked to go to Congress to testify before the House of Representatives about this impending tariff against international peanuts coming in, because Carver had created, again, out of the peanut, 300 different products and made it possible then for small farmers, big farmers, to be viable economically from growing peanuts, cowpeas, and whatever else. So he goes to the House of Representatives, 1920, to testify about the peanut and this tariff. Now, these are all white guys, okay? I got some images I passed by them of that meeting. You can also go online, Congressional Record, and get the entire testimony. They said, hey, boy, you here to testify? Yes, I've been invited. He had a real high voice, you know. I was asked to come here by the peanut company to say a few words about the peanut. All right, boy, you got 10 minutes. What do you got to say? And he began speaking in this scientific, well, he was a man of science and a man of God. Didn't separate them. Began speaking like the peanut was his son, his daughter, his mama, reverently, scientifically, describing what he'd been doing in Tuskegee, opening up to make whatever we need in America, we got you on the farmland. What he was saying. Spoke for 10 minutes, and one guy said, hey, boy, you bring that watermelon with you? He said, well, sir, you know, the watermelon would be perfect for some dessert. Maybe we can have some together when I finish up. Okay? They said, well, okay, boy, you got 10 more minutes. Come on, hurry up. Because of his charisma, because of his love for all humanity, regardless of how he was treated. He was there an hour and a half. An hour and a half. When the newspapers would cover his talks, like when he came to Richmond, he might have come down to Greenville for the Rosenwald School, traveled around. They would say things like, he was mesmerizing. He was captivating. Again, he went to Iowa State College, got his bachelor's, his master's, his friends. Iowa was like the big-time ag school. The guy named Henry H. Wallace, who was a professor there in Derry, went on to become Secretary of Ag in the 20s. His son, the other Henry Wallace, Secretary of Ag and Vice President under Theodore Roosevelt. Carver knew all those folks. He knew all the presidents of the 1900s. They would call him for consultation. So, Brian, about charisma, he could talk to presidents and peasants. He could talk to scientists and farmers that couldn't read and write. He could talk to children and elders. He could talk to the faith community, the scientific community. So he had a lot of charisma. What happened, Ford died in the 30s. His son decided to go with the oil companies rather than American farmers. Carter died in 43. And what happened, we began to pigeonhole Carter as the peanut wizard. And yes, he was all that. But he was so much more. He was so much more than that. So what happens, we have not really understood his full charisma, the full depth. You know, when he was a Tuskegee, he would pray every morning like Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. He went out, early on, 1898, to the garden, and he asked God, like, I want you to reveal the secrets to me of life. Please reveal me secrets of life. And God said, Carver, like, usually God is like, categorized as a male. That's another whole story. God said, that's big boy stuff. Okay? That's big boy stuff. But what I will do for you, because you've been faithful, what I will do for you, if you go out and talk to the peanut plant and ask the plant to reveal its secrets, it will happen. So I'm going to give you the lowly peanut. Now, how many of us talk to plants? To ask them, Brother here does. How many of us, I go out to Muir Woods, the big 2,500-year-old redwood trees. They were around since Christ walked the earth, we say. They might know something.
It's a little over.
Oh, let's go.
I acknowledge that.
Hey, see me afterwards. Love y'all. Thank you all so much. Thank you all.
Yes, tomorrow is my big one of my favorite pastors.
You a relative as well?
I am a friend, and I'm a friend of Jim's, and I'm a Daytonian.
Oh, okay.
Renee Smith.
Brian Martin.
Nice
to meet you.
What's the last name?
Martin.
Martin.
I'll
Oh,
give you my card.
thank you. You know Jeffrey Payne?
Sorry?
You know Jeffrey Payne? Or, let's see, I've been gone about 20-some years. Let's
Jeff
see.
Payne. I'm trying to.
Mike Cromartie?
No, I haven't met. No, I've been here about 9 years.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so you are in
Miami
the
Valley
Department of
Regional
Development.
Planning
Oh,
Commission.
Regional Planning Commission.
Yeah,
Okay.
MVRPC.
Okay.
War happened across the South. So my family in Vistula, they had about 2,000 acres of land. They owned the cotton gin. And
I loved your question, by the way,
And the
too.
folks came and burned all the stuff.
Maybe he'll include that
I
in
didn't even
his
touch on
presentation.
the dispossessed of land occurred after the Great Summer.
Oh yeah, now there's oil mills in that land.
Oh yeah.
How you doing,
Burn
sir?
you out of take you out. Oh man, talk about black land laws.
Kids are going to Columbus.
Yeah.
What's that side of town?
But I'm
We
gonna get
were
on because
last-
I need to finish up my
Yeah,
presentation because
Galloway,
I didn't have internet in here, so I gotta put my videos and stuff.
We went there.
All right, man. I'll see you later.
I'll be all weekend. I'll be till Sunday.
Oh,
Yes, yes.
And was that that one of your parents that was in that picture?
No, he married into my family. He married one of my cousins.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And so you married him, and so was it the father's name? I think it was
That's true.
Now, that's his,
But in America,
his family
a lot of us,
my cousin
this is
that
Dr.
he
Mr.
married, that's from Western Kentucky.
Woodson wrote a book called
Madison is Richmond, like south of Lexington.
Uh-huh.
So he was covered on both sides with ag and farming and a lot of
Quite a few people staying afterwards
Good to have you here.
to meet Jim and ask some questions.
I love being here.
I connected with Central State
Spike did a thing called Bamboozle.
and
He done been bamboozled.
looking to connect more with them. They were doing some micro farming out there.
Well, they have now that they have their land designation, long overdue, but they're staffing up, so that's really exciting.
Yeah. And so I look to connect you. So
Yeah.
we'll look to see your name in there somewhere.
Okay.
Doing great work.
Possibly. Thank you, sir.
Aaron, do you live in Columbus?
Yes.
I do too. I'm from Dayton, but I've been in Columbus about 20 some years.
Yeah. So I'm on the south side of Columbus.
Yeah, are you? Okay.
So we're doing some urban farming there.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Urban Crest?
Oh yes.
It's a historically.
Absolutely.
Yes.
African American community. Yeah, you said, yeah.
I know some of the family, church family that I'm.
Did he say, let me get my phone? I got your phone.
Oh, is this it?
That's not what he said, is it?
Yeah. That's a
Oh.
long conversation.
Yeah, Urban Crest. I live in Gahanna,
Okay.
Absolutely. But
but I'm from Jefferson Township.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And my family has property in Manchester, Kentucky, Clay County,
Okay.
near London.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Circle, the labyrinth, the triangle, the eye of heart. I mean, all
Mine
these
was
are-
from
are
Middlesboro.
vibrations.
Dad was from Greenville. The only way they could have met was Kentucky State.
Okay, yeah. I did some research for Dr. Ann Butler down there when she was still alive.
Okay.
At
At K-State. Okay.
She was researching, well, I'm having a senior moment. The gentleman who was the first president of Kentucky State University, he ended up moving to Columbus, actually, I think, after his retirement. And she was having me trace some records on he and his wife.
Thank you for all your work. I'll take part as well. Love to.
This is awesome
Yep.
presentation.
Well, he's been like this all the life that I know. He's been all about Mother Earth and food, all of that. So
Thank you, Jeff, for being here.
he's authentic and he's been at this a long time.
Continuing family legacy.
To introduce myself, I'm Megan Bachman.
I'm Megan Bartlett.
Center for General Practice.
Okay. Are you local or?
Yeah, it's in Yellow Springs.
Oh, okay. Awesome. I think I get your emails probably. Yeah.
You know, I was on your website. Have you been doing something around the history of investment and development? Okay.
Like late September.
Yeah, redlining.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Waiting.
Can you share with the where you are in that process? And
Well, we formed an institution
Yeah, y'all present.
race issues, social issues, as well as aging practices. So that kind of got us in research on data and got us into discovering more about redlining and why we have, African Americans from historically the West Side, and other ethnic groups north and so forth. So it really explains a lot.
have you gone into the history of I-675?
Oh, yeah. It was just I got pictures and I was like, oh my God. Analysis of that thing. Looking at 1980 versus 2010 before.
Time magazine called him the Black Da Vinci. He did so much.
Everything new.
It's hard within our certain mindset to wrap our arms
Instead of
around.
instead of the light rail
We had a lot of choices. We had so many choices.
Then again, what
And
happened?
we took the easy one.
Different things happened.
We coordinated.
Even
and
black
we
folk
all of that
in the
development.
60s.
If you look at our regional equity profile on
Okay.
our website,
I'm gonna take a look, thank you.
that'll look at the data. And we have mapping behind it.
antagonize
We partnered
white
with
folk.
Kerwin Institute in
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Ohio State.
You've got
Yeah.
that so far? Oh.
But
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Why is it gotta be a
it's so
problem?
painful
Yeah.
to see that. And then now,
so in some ways, we ourselves
this week I was at
disown
the
him.
Metro Library, Think TV, locally,
Then,
did an awesome
in the South,
1-hour documentary.
in Alabama.
Really?
It's on their
First of all,
website.
he had seen a brother get hung and burned at the stake
Fantastic.
out in Kansas. He was
Yeah.
a
Well, I
young
would
guy.
love to, it's a story that
His
we're
mom
interested in telling you.
had
We're
been
kind of interested
kidnapped
in
away
bioregional
by night
information.
riders.
So we
I mean,
have
talk about a
side
difficult
farm
child.
in South Springfield, and we partner with Edgemont Solar and Co-op Dayton
But
City
he and
Market.
Booker T
So
understood,
just the idea
and we
of,
got work to do.
you know, for the whole,
We're trying to help black folks
the whole
survive.
bioregion is kind of like a person.
South.
We can't be all, we
And how
can't
do
be
we
healthy
do that?
unless we're all
Oh, no
healthy
doubt.
and whole.
And
So,
know about
review
that.
also.
Yeah.
But anyway, but also the
So we
oil
probably
industry
should work together.
yeah, I would
You
love
know,
it. And
Ford,
I don't know if
son,
you write articles or if
said,
there's
"Papa,
an article that
you
can
know
kind
who's
of
awesome?
summarize for people in the
because
area
this
that
is
history
thing
and
called
that.
cheap
It
oil.
would be great to tag.
We're going to get locked into,
We're looking for a person
and
that,
we're going to then
our
sell our
expert
souls
left, just left.
to
But
Exxon, Mobil, Shell Oil
resumes
with the car companies and go that route
You know, I don't.
to make things
in.
rather than some people close to pump. Wasn't
Good
just
thing about,
soybeans,
the amazing thing about the
peanuts, because again, so this book about the green vision is an incredible book.
Oh, really?
That they were their goal was to make even the rubber, make everything from the agricultural products. Grown by farmers. They had an experiment up in Michigan. Ford, a research laboratory. They were always, you know, 14 down.
I can guarantee you, Baba Jim will be invited back to this conference
Again, they were, there's a film that shows
in future years.
other cars, and Ford has an accident, and he's hitting the bumper of the car, just bouncing off.
Absolutely,
That was about the most exciting Q&A I've ever listened to, partaken of.
So I think there was some intentionality on the part of the agribusinesses,
But kind of then brought
the oil industry, to discredit Carter and Ford and say, well, he was just a peanut business. There were articles in the paper talking about this scientist says he gets his information from God. Now, how crazy is that? There was a lot of media propaganda read about it. But they were discrediting him as being a scientist. He relies on God for guidance and direction in the laboratory. Carver would say, I go out and meet with God, and I come into the laboratory and execute what God has given me. So there were things like that that were going on around the country to make then his legacy rather limited and said to be not usable. I had a slide, I didn't show it. Sometimes I'll do these previous talks, and I would think, well, that's about an hour talk. It comes like, 3 hours. But anyway, one of the slides I had in there was this idea of is Carver relevant? NASA
few blocks.
has this project with Tuskegee
There's a lot of good stuff going on in the downtown area, for sure. And
to where they
How long have
are
you been
growing.
with this?
so I was with them,
Skylab,
like I said, like in the early 2000s. I
Space
just
Lab,
returned.
what
I
it's called.
did 10 years in journalism.
Fruit
and
potato
Yale Springs
as a
State, which is why I'm interested in
long-term
the stories.
You still
and,
the director?
item.
you the
no, I'm not the director. I'm the
Astronauts,
assistant
astronauts
director. Susan
to
Jennings.
eat.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
who
Probably
I
know her.
know.
Yeah.
I've met her through the
And
foundation.
the space flight.
Oh.
A lot of we served together on
Because
the Greater Dayton
Oh,
Constitution.
you
NASA
do? Okay,
understands.
fantastic.
Yeah, although I stepped
Carver's
down a couple
legacy.
of years ago.
Okay.
And how important
But
it is
yes, I remember.
today.
So that's how I got under your.
We're the
list,
ones.
sir.
Okay,
I've
great.
seen,
I'm so glad that you're on.
I participated in one of
But
your.
so we have to, in my
Black
view, as part of the
farming
work that
cool.
many of us are
That's
doing,
virtual.
you
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
Caught a few
try
sessions
to
on that. So
bring
excellent
this
work.
Yeah,
legacy
thank you.
to
Thank you for your work.
Yep.
Nice to meet
You're
you.
welcome.
and, presentations.
You made me think of something. I just heard the last bit of what you were saying back when. Let me see if I can finish this. I don't even.